All right, well, now that Travis and Leslie have set the stage, I get the pleasure this morning of welcoming our keynote speaker, who has become a dear mentor to me over the years. Dr. Darolia is the chief economist at the U.S. Department of Education. He is currently on leave from the University of Kentucky, where he holds the Wendell H. Ford Professorship in Public Policy and is a professor of public policy and economics. At UK, he has also served as the Associate Dean for Research of the Graduate School, Associate Director of the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration, and Associate Director of the UK Centre for Poverty Research. I think it's safe to say UK is very lucky to have him. His research agenda includes questions about how public policy affects educational decisions and outcomes more broadly through economic mobility and financial security. Personally, as a former Martin School student, it is my absolute pleasure to have Dr. Darolia join us today. Please welcome him with me.
Just make sure these slides work. Thanks, Michaela. As Michaela said, she's a graduate of our program. I think somehow she got through the program without having to take my econometrics class, but we'll let her slide for that. We've been really proud to place a number of students within CPE, Michaela, Ryan, Adam. I don't know if they're here today, but a really fantastic partner for the school. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm going to be talking about navigating the future of the healthcare workforce, but I'm really going to have a focus on post-secondary educational pathways. Before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about my last year and a half. I've been commuting every week to Washington, D.C., and participating in a lot of national and international conversations related to education and workforce issues. But one thing I've been consistently amazed about is the extent to which people with no ties to this state remark how impressed they are with how Kentucky is really advancing and leading on many dimensions relating to education and the workforce. This includes working intently to bring people into the post-secondary system, helping them persist and finish their credentials. It means that we have innovative financing programs that are attempting to directly connect education initiatives and workforce needs. We also have one of the best data systems in the country, which allows us to understand conditions and help evaluate solutions. And I think a lot of credit goes to CPE and Kentucky Stats for doing that as well. This is all credit to CPE and the leadership of Aaron and Leslie and all the folks at CPE. But it is also a direct result of people in this room, the creative solutions, the care for students and workers, and the genuine efforts to work together. You know, I hear a lot about how nobody works together anymore, and every time I return to this state, I see people working together all the time. So kudos to all of you. So today what I'm going to do is talk about three general things. The first thing I'm going to do is just provide some descriptive trends. This is really just to set the stage. I think these are going to be things that you've already seen before many times. Then I'm going to touch on some evolving workforce needs, and finally talk about credentials of value and some emerging credential trends. Maybe in a way that will be less than satisfactory to a lot of people, what I hope to do today is not actually provide a lot of solutions to any of the issues that we're going to be talking about. The solutions are going to come from the people in this room, from conversations today, the conversations that you've been having already. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is really ask a lot of questions. That's what I do as a researcher, that's what I do as a professor. What I hope those questions will help us do is engender discussion as you go through today and in the future conversations. So with that, let me start. So as I mentioned, this is probably should be familiar to most of you. I could have put up a number of numerous statistics that would show you that the healthcare industry both has a huge demand for workers, but is also unlikely to be able to meet that demand based on current trends. Right, so here the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what I show you here is that the job growth is expected to be faster in the healthcare industry than pretty much every other industry save a few, and is going to account for almost half of all new jobs in the future. That equates to about 10% employment growth by 2032. And as already been mentioned, there are a number of dimensions to this. There's an aging population, increased demand for mental health professionals, chronic disease specialists, and many other fields. And for something that's near and dear to my heart, as we collect more data on health and health outcomes, there's going to be an increased need for data specialists and informatics specialists in the healthcare sector to be able to analyze all of these things. So more broadly, as emerging technologies are integrated into the healthcare system, we're going to see an increased demand for dynamic and technologically savvy healthcare workers. Now, this increased demand, as you all know, is likely going to exacerbate existing labor shortages in the industry. So the takeaway here, again, that you've probably heard over and over again, it is that it is incredibly important to grow the healthcare workforce and to cultivate a diverse set of talent. Now, as an economist, I believe that markets work. And so typically when we think about a need for something, we would expect supply to then meet that need, right? So that there's a demand for healthcare workers. Most of the positions, a lot of the positions are relatively high paid. And so you should expect supply to meet that demand. What we see here is just a national chart of the share of credentials in the 3 different levels, certificates, associate's degrees, and bachelor's degrees, in healthcare fields. And so what you can see here in that blue and reddish line here, which are the certificate and associate's degrees, we actually see a declining share over time in the number of students who are getting these credentials in healthcare fields. Now, we see sort of the opposite here in the bachelor's degrees, where we see an increasing rate, but maybe not to the share we would need, and certainly not to the share that we would need to be able to meet the forecast of healthcare demand that we see here. So partly this could be a function of an expanding and diversifying healthcare industry that has needs for specialists who are not just directly working in the clinic, but again, working with data, working with information systems as well that aren't going to be well captured in a graph like this. But I think a takeaway, again, is that we don't have the production that we're going to need in credentials to really meet the needs. And again, this is across the country. What I have here now is some graphs that specifically look at post-secondary degrees in Kentucky. On the left here is kind of all non-healthcare subjects, and on the right here are subjects in health professions. The story in Kentucky is a little bit more complicated. So we actually see bachelor's degree shares rising drastically, right? And we see actually less growth relative to other fields in our associate's degrees and our certificate production as well. So I'm going to dive into this a little bit later in the talk. But again, what I wanted to do today was just set the stage with some of these descriptive trends so that we could start to ask some key questions. And so the key questions that are going to kind of underlie the rest of this conversation is how do we boost labor supply and bring in a diverse array of students to meet our healthcare needs? How do we support our post-secondary institutions in training the future healthcare workforce? And as I'll talk about later, I think our post-secondary institutions are really the critical or a critical partner in this. And how do we encourage innovation among institutions and employers while protecting students and public funds? So next, what I'm going to turn to are evolving workforce needs. So I know a lot of people have different opinions on AI. And my friend Carl and I were having a great conversation last night. I don't know if I see Carl in the room right now, but I figured I would elaborate on AI, just given some of our conversation. So there's widespread fear that artificial intelligence will negatively affect the job market. I just put up a couple statistics here. In a Gallup poll from last year, about 3 out of every 4 people in this country who were surveyed thought that this would lead to a decrease in jobs. Not just a decrease in jobs well into the future, but sometime this decade. I put in a quote here from Elon Musk, again, sort of a nod to Carl, because he said he was his favorite guy. But he has this quote here: at some point, no job will be needed because of an AI magic genie that can do everything you want. Now, some of these are maybe outlandish statements or kind of widespread fears. History tells us that innovation and technological advancement will typically not actually destroy jobs, but will actually create new jobs. And it does this by increasing productivity and augmenting workers' capabilities. Okay? So industries experiencing technological progress tend to grow and not to shrink. Now, a key point of this, however, if we look at history, as we look at the advent of other technologies in history, Job creation and destruction are not likely to be equally distributed across job categories and skills. Okay, and this is a key thing because the middle skill jobs are the ones that tend to be destroyed. So we need to work to make sure that there aren't people that are harmed in the short run because of this. But also, what I'm going to try to make a case for you is that the people who benefit from increased technologies and are likely to benefit from AI technology are experts. And AI and our technological advancements have the opportunity to democratize expertise. So a key question, which is going to be whether automation or augmentation will accelerate faster. Now, I'm not a futurist. I don't even know what a futurist is. There are a lot of people who try to make these proclamations, and I've listed some sites here if you want to look into it. But I see this as an area of potential, and I see it specifically as an area of potential in the healthcare industry, and let me explain why. And so if you'll allow me to have a little divulgence right here on Richard Feynman's bird. Is anybody familiar with Richard Feynman? People familiar with him? See a few hands here. So Richard Feynman is a well-known physicist. He worked on a lot of different things, but one of the things he was well known for was being a big thinker as a physicist. And I put the quote up here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it goes something like this. Do you see that bird? In this language, it has this name. In that language, it has that name. But even if you know all the names for it, you still know nothing about the bird. You only know something about people, what they call the bird. And the key point, and I think about this all the time as we think about the evolving workforce, is that there's a difference between knowing the name of something and actually knowing something. Okay? Knowing names does not constitute knowledge. It does not constitute understanding. And so one of the reasons that I believe that AI and some of our advancements in these spaces will not eliminate the need for expertise, but instead amplify it, is because AI will increase the productivity of experts, okay? Lowering the costs of gathering information and computation. So it'll lower the cost of knowing names, but it cannot lower the cost of understanding. So consider the physician who needs to diagnose some condition among their patients. AI and our emerging technologies are likely to lower the cost of gathering information, lower the cost of acquiring cases that might be happening around the world, happening real time. It might be able to provide some best practices for how people in the past have successfully navigated and assessed and treated that condition. What it cannot substitute for is the judgment for how to best do this in any individual situation. Right? So while the information acquisition might be automated, the decision-making and the judgment will not be able to be automated. So we still need the worker to be able to do that. Okay? So AI is unlikely to substitute for expertise. But what is that expertise? I've already talked about judgment and understanding, but also creativity. So judgment, understanding, and creativity will remain irreplaceable skills. They will remain irreplaceable skills within the healthcare sector. And the exciting piece about this is that it has the potential to not only amplify expertise, but to democratize it. So people who maybe didn't have skills that are necessary in today's workforce have an encyclopedic memory of every connection between a marker and some treatment. That might not be necessary anymore. So people who have skills in other dimensions are able to become experts. And I think that's the exciting piece of the evolving healthcare workforce. So the key questions in this section, what I'd like to bring up, is under a lens where expertise will continue to command a market premium. Again, using some economics talk here, but continue to command a market premium. And what I mean by that will be continue to be successful in getting jobs, getting paid well. What constitutes expertise in tomorrow's workforce? What are the irreplaceable skills? We first need to think about that. How do we train our students to gather these irreplaceable skills in the future? Okay? So how do we prepare a healthcare workforce that is trained on irreplaceable skills and is adaptable to future changes? And what is the role of post-secondary institutions in preparing students to adapt? So this is one of the reasons that I believe post-secondary institutions are so critical in preparing tomorrow's healthcare workers. If expertise is necessary, we are not going to see expertise taught only online or through other machines. Expertise comes through practice. It comes through interaction. It comes through teaching methods that we haven't even developed yet. And so much of the conversation in at least the higher ed space related to emerging technologies is really focused on things like, how do we prevent students from cheating on assignments? How do we prevent them from relying too heavily on ChatGPT or OpenAI or another technology to write their essays for them? How do we create learning bots and advising bots that reduce the cost of providing that education? And I think those are all critically important questions. But I don't think that's the first order question as we think about the impact of technology on our workforce and on post-secondary institutions. What we should be thinking about is, how do we train students on those irreplaceable skills? And this is going to require changes to our curricula, to our assessments, to our classroom practices, and yes, maybe it will necessitate changes to who is in our classrooms as well. The other thing I want to mention here, and this is a theme through a lot of the things that I'll be talking about today, is that we really need to be thoughtful about who will have access to the most productive educational and career pathways, right? Technological advances, evolution in workforces, whether we think about forecasts for the future or historical patterns, has meant that typically inequality is widened before it is shrunk. So that means that some people are going to be left behind as the economy grows, as the economy evolves. So we need to think carefully about, one, trying to prevent that from happening, while still allowing that evolution to take place. Two, how to provide supports for people who are likely to experience short-term pain with this. And three, making sure that shrinkage of inequality then shrinks as rapidly as possible when that window arises. And so, as history tells us, we need to be really thoughtful about who the winners and losers are going to be with some of this technological change. And again, my own view is that this is going to be positive for society, for the state, for the country. But we still need to be thoughtful about who are those who are going to access all of these lucrative pathways in the future. So the next thing I want to talk about are some trends in credentials. So for some of you who have seen me do some talks in the past couple years, you'll know that this is a big area of focus for me, a big area of focus for this state. But I think it's really important to understand and recognize, especially for educators and people training, hiring workers in this state. So the first thing I want to talk about are the dimensions of credential value. So if you go to any higher ed conference or any higher ed association meeting nowadays, somebody will bring up the idea of credentials of value or some other measure of value. CPE has this as one of its goals right now. I think this is incredibly important. As we see attainment increase across the country, maybe not as good as we're doing here in Kentucky, but still increasing across the country, the bigger question becomes not just, are we getting students credentials, but are they getting credentials that are valuable? Now, value can take on a lot of different definitions. Okay, and so my task here today is not to try to convince you that my definition is right, but just I want to lay out some different things that matter, and then I want to highlight one that people don't talk about, and that's risk and uncertainty, that I think is of utmost importance. So first, if we think about the credential value, the first thing we want is obviously strong benefits. Okay, so we may think about this as the ability to get a job, to progress in one's career, and to have adequate compensation and benefits. Okay? We also want those benefits to be accompanied by appropriate costs. Now, those costs could be direct outlays. We often think about the cost of education as just how much am I giving out for cost of attendance? What are my tuition and fees? How much am I going to spend to live while I'm there? We also need to think about opportunity costs. What are people giving up in order to go to this education? Last night at dinner, or maybe after dinner, there was a really robust conversation about working students and how we can't ask a lot of our students to take time off and work full-time while they are doing their studies. And that is increasingly, the case that students are working while they're in school. And not just working, they need to work. And so we need to think about the opportunity costs for them. The third cost I want to bring up here, which I mentioned already, is risk and uncertainty. Okay? Risk is costly. Uncertainty is costly. And it can infuse itself in all of the things that I spoke about before. Okay? It can mean that somebody may be uncertain about the actual benefits that they will get from a credential. Right? So I talk to students all the time, and I always try to communicate to them, here is the range of earnings and employment outcomes that are expected in this field. Students always ask, where do I think I will be in this distribution of earnings? They don't use that language because they're not nerds like me, but they basically ask that question, right? I always pose it back to them and say, where do you think you're going to be in this? Every single student says they're going to be at the very top of the range, right? That's a different issue. That's a numerical literacy that we'll work on later. But if you have uncertainty, if you're unsure if you're going to be at the very top or the very bottom of a range of earnings or employment outcomes or other types of outcomes, that puts costs on you. What are the chances of a catastrophic outcome? What if I borrow a lot to go get this program that is expected to lead to a lucrative field, a lucrative career, but I'm not the one who gets that? What if something happens to my mother or my spouse, my child, that prevents me from working? What are the chances of a catastrophic outcome? We know that catastrophic outcomes happen much more than people like to admit, but we don't build a system that provides insurance against that. What happens if I have bad luck when I'm on campus? You know, another conversation last night was about mentors and people that you can look up to on campus. I bet you, because you're in this room and all of the people being successful in this room, many of you have a really positive story to tell about a mentor, a professor, a teacher. A lot of the people who didn't make it into this room have a really negative story to tell about somebody like that as well. And then specific to things like financial aid, financing, will money be available for me to afford my education? These are all questions I could sit up here for hours and hours and talk about others. But risk and uncertainty will negatively affect students and workers. It will prevent them from investing in themselves, which we want them to do. It will prevent them from investing in themselves, which the public needs them to do. Right? Not only the people who get the education benefit from that. We all benefit from this, especially in a healthcare industry where we have such a need for workers. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about a type of credential that has gotten incredibly popular across the country, but especially here in Kentucky. And one of the cases I'm going to make to you is that the rise of certificates in these shorter term programs is directly a function of risk and uncertainty. Okay? And while I think it's an incredibly good thing that Kentucky is a state leader, a national leader in the production of certificates in some of these shorter term programs, it does not come without risks. And as employers, as educators, I want you to be aware of those risks. So as we think about educating the workforce of tomorrow, we can think about those risks as well. So this is a national chart about the rise of certificates. And the solid black line is the rise of what we call short-term certificates, or certificates that take less than 1 year to complete. And as you can see here, they've grown drastically over time. Okay? The green line is what we call longer-term certificates, and these are certificates that take anywhere from 1 to 4 years to complete. Now, here in Kentucky, largely we're operating on the shorter end of this scale, and I'll show some descriptives on this in a moment. But these somewhat longer certificates are still quite popular in many other parts of the country. So there's been a rapid rise in certificates awarded, especially in the less than 1 year space. Okay? The number of certificates awarded annually nationally has grown 60% over the past 20 years. So currently, about 1 in every 4 credentials awarded by a post-secondary institution in the United States is a certificate. Okay? People are often really surprised at that. And that is almost surely an undercount, because we're not counting non-credit certificates, we're not counting graduate certificates in this graph, we're not counting a lot of other certificates and training modules that people do that lead to a credential. There's a huge amount of variation across sectors and states, okay? So sometimes people will come to me and say, oh, that's just a for-profit college story, or oh, that's just a 2-year college story. It is not. The largest growth in certificates in this country is at public 4-year institutions. Already, the public 4 years account for about a quarter of all less than 1 year certificates. And it is growing drastically. I don't think I have it today, but if I showed you the chart, it looks like a vertical line in the recent years. Now, the other thing that I'm not going to talk much about today, but I think is incredibly important about this, is that this is also a byproduct of blurring lines between post-secondary education and many other domains. Secondary education being a big one. Many of these pathways start in high school. Some of them start even before high school, where people are starting coursework or credentials in high school that either lead to something that they follow into the workforce or into post-secondary education or not. It also now drastically overlaps with workforce training. Right? You can be in a class in many states as a credit higher ed student sitting next to a non-credit workforce training student in that exact same classroom, the exact same curriculum, the exact same teacher. So the lines that we traditionally had between higher ed and and secondary ed, or even middle school, between education and workforce, all of those lines are blurring. And I think one of the ways we're seeing them manifest is really in the rise of certificates. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, you showed me a chart before that showed in Kentucky that actually bachelor's degree production in healthcare was increasing, but maybe not certificates. And let me just show you here that this is national. I didn't pull this for Kentucky itself. The most popular certificate fields, on the left here are the less than 1 year certificates, on the right here is the 1 to 4 year certificates. Healthcare is either the most popular or the second most popular in both of those instances. If we were to look at the Kentucky data, healthcare certificates are among the largest. The other one's skilled trades. A lot of people, this includes advanced manufacturing as well. But this is a critical piece. These are people who are going directly into your healthcare workforce. These are also people, again, who might be starting in high school or after secondary education, who are using this as an entry point into their educational pathway, right? So regardless of whether you are employing people with certificates directly into your workforce, or you think you are educating students in this margin, you are. Or if you haven't already, you are going to be soon. Now, I have my glasses up here, and I can barely see this right now, but let me just kind of describe what this chart here is on the right. So we have all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. You can't really see the titles of the names on the y-axis. The dot represents the share of credentials that are undergraduate certificates. So the share of undergraduate credentials that are undergraduate certificates by state. And I put the blue arrow up there because that's Kentucky. Okay? So in our most recent year, this is from federal accounting across all the states, the 22-23 school year, Kentucky led the nation in the share of credentials provided that are certificates. Okay? So that's about 34,000 certificates awarded. About 29,000 of those were less than one-year certificates. That's about 3 certificates awarded for every associate's degree. It's about 1.5 certificates awarded for every bachelor's degree. And it's about half of all the credentials in the state. Now again, I think we should be applauded for this. I think Aaron and his team should be applauded for this because I do think this has a ton of potential. But again, I'm going to highlight some risks here in a moment. This next graph here is just less than one-year certificates. Okay? So whereas the one before was all undergraduate certificates, this one plots that same graph, the share of undergraduate credentials that are less than one-year certificates. As we can see here again, Kentucky is leading the nation in this. Okay? So I think this is incredibly important for the modern student to bring them into higher education. Okay? But it also potentially brings together risks. So let's talk about certificates as a risk management tool for the student. Okay? Where we have seen this be most attractive to students is for many learners who were not traditionally well served by the system of higher education. Okay? So if we think about workers like displaced workers, right? These can be people who were part of a mass layoff. We see when people are at plants or other types of major employers that have large layoffs, there's a big rush for reskilling. But it doesn't have to be sort of a one-time sort of mass plant closure as well. As we see people return to their education and skill training from the labor force, we often see them dipping their toe in higher education, right? Seeing if this makes sense for them. So displaced workers, adult learners, right? People who maybe didn't take the ACT or SAT for a long while, haven't set foot in a classroom for a while. They're looking for easier entry points into higher education. Okay? Working learners and learning workers, right? You know, in my department at the University of Kentucky, when I'm back there, we talk a lot about trying to be flexible for working learners and learning workers. As Michaela can tell you, we're not doing a very good job, right? But certificate programs are doing a much, much better job. And then just more generally, risk-averse students. Okay? Risk-averse students, whether because they're in one of these categories that I've already mentioned, or because they have questions about the uncertainty related to their benefits or costs, as I mentioned before. So certificates are cheaper in both direct time and time to complete. And so how the economists would think about this is this provides a lower cost of entry into higher education. Okay? Sometimes we think about some of these programs that are described as on-ramps into higher education. And I think in that way, they have incredible potential to diversify our enrollment on our campuses or online, and eventually our workforce. But they don't come without risks, because the lower cost of entry also means, in these cases, there's a lower cost of exit. And maybe that's okay. Right? Maybe for a lot of students, getting a credential, like a certificate that is shorter term than an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, is exactly the right type of educational program for them. For a lot of students, that is definitely true. But what the research shows us is that for students who are able to bear the cost of going for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years or 8 years, the longer you are in school, especially in the healthcare industry, the more money you will make in your career. So these programs do a fantastic job of opening the doors to many more students. The question is, are we making sure that students are staying in if that is the best decision for them? The former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors has a very famous paper where she called sort of the expansion of credentials in this country as a democratizing but diverting function. It is a way to democratize access to higher education, but it also has the potential to divert people away from their most lucrative pathways. So one of the questions, and I'm not going to have an answer for you today, but what questions we're going to have about this, is are these pathways actually a stepping stone to degrees or other educational pathways which are really going to be the most fruitful for them? So here again, gonna just kind of pose some key questions here so that you can think about them in your spare time, in the shower, wherever you do your deepest thinking. A key question here is what are the benefits and costs of certificate programs? Okay, the prior literature on certificates is actually quite positive. Okay, it finds earnings effects of, on one hand maybe zero, but up to 50% of pre-earnings wages. Now there's huge variation by context, so which state it is, which industry it is, the length of that certificate, and also by gender. And we also have limited research on longer-term outcomes and outcomes beyond earnings employment, including societal returns. But this is a key question we need to answer as so many more of our students and so many more of our future workers are following these pathways. Related to the question about whether they are stepping stones to degrees, one of the ways we can think about certificates is whether they are stacked effectively, right? So we can think about these entry points as come in, take a class or two, earn a certificate, and then enroll in the longer-term degree program. There's another way, which again, I give credit to people in the state for thinking about, which is more about a modular educational pathway. What if we came in and we gave discrete modular educational credentials that accumulated, and at the end of it, you have both certificates, a number of certificates and a degree. So can they be stacked effectively? Are certificates portable across other institution employers, and are benefits durable over time? So this is, for the labor economist, one of the key questions with these credentials, okay? Often we think about shorter term programs as giving very applied skills. I need to learn how to read an X-ray, so this program is going to teach me how to read an X-ray. We think about longer term programs as providing general skills, an opportunity to write, an opportunity to think big thoughts, critical thinking. We cannot have a tracking system where students who pursue these pathways are not exposed to those critical thinking skills, are not exposed to those general skills. Because we know that very specific applied skills are not good for the worker in their longer run, because those skills need to be durable over time. What I mean by that is they need to persist. They need to be a building block for somebody's skills throughout their career. It needs to be a skill that somebody can say, this employment situation is not working out for me, and I can go to a different employer. So we need to make sure, as more students pursue these pathways, that the skills that we're teaching in them are portable and durable. Already mentioned the applied versus general skills. And then I've mentioned this already, but are students forgoing more lucrative educational pathways for the ease of shorter programs? Not only in that question, but which students are doing this? Okay? Are specific types of students more likely to pursue or be directed into some fields versus other? Does this potentially widen inequality and income and wealth disparities? There's the former president of Howard University, Wayne Frederick, is a former physician himself. And he has given many comments where he's very concerned about this. At an event that I helped organize that Aaron was a part of a couple years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, Wayne Frederick made the comment that the black physician is going to be a unicorn in the future. And he was specifically talking about the fact that certain students are going to be directed into these shorter term pathways. And again, maybe this is right for a lot of students. But if we are tracking students again, based on their demographics, based on some imperfect assessment, then we are potentially, again, only opening up lucrative pathways to certain students. And so we need to be very careful about this. So I'm not going to talk about this next graph in too much detail because I know there's going to be a panel on apprenticeships later. But I wanted to give another example of another illustration of are we thinking about wide opportunities for a lot of students. And so just pulled from Kentucky Works the registered apprenticeships, and I know this is an undercount of how we might think of apprenticeships or externships or applied learning opportunities here, and plotted where those are, okay? And so for those of you who are from Kentucky, I think most of you are, you'll notice that the biggest concentration is really in Jefferson and Fayette counties, right? So this is another dimension of access. Who is getting access to these opportunities? I think Joy is going to be talking about registered apprenticeships later. I'm a big fan supporter of this. If, for right now, a lot of those opportunities are only for folks who live in the Louisville or Lexington areas, then that is not access to these types of opportunities. Okay, and again, I know that this is somewhat of an undercount because it's just what was registered on the Kentucky Works website, but just to illustrate the point. We need to be really thoughtful about who has access to these opportunities that we think are really important. Okay, let me close with a couple of thoughts. So as I mentioned before, the lines between traditionally siloed domains are blurring. Higher education and secondary education, education and workforce training. I think a lot about how students pay, and so I put up here Title IV funds, which is how we traditionally fund students within the higher education space, versus WIOA funds, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, how we traditionally fund students in the labor space. These lines are blurring, and so that means that educational systems, post-secondary educational systems, K-12 educational systems, and workforce systems need to increasingly work together. I'm excited about the opportunities in tomorrow's workforce and tomorrow's healthcare workforce, but advancement is not likely to be equal, at least not at first. Inequality is likely to widen before it shrinks. We have a role to play in making sure that we limit that as much as possible. It is critical to reduce risk and uncertainty so that students can invest in themselves. As I mentioned, one of the reasons we've seen this shift in credential seeking is a direct function of the risk that students perceive in their higher education and education pursuits. I work a lot with the higher education system on a federal level. The number of students that say they are worried about how they are going to afford education, what is happening with our future education system, are the returns going to be there, is financing going to be there, it is enormous. And this risk is incredibly costly to people who we want to invest in themselves. Data is the new gold. I already gave a shout out to CPE and Kentucky Stats before, but I just want to reiterate it here. Our state is one of the envies of the country. I participate in state longitudinal data systems almost every week in my federal role. Kentucky is routinely mentioned as one of the best places to be able to really understand conditions, especially within the higher ed and especially in the workforce space. And so I do want to give a shout out to CPE and Kentucky Stats here. This is incredibly important. Before we can fix problems and find solutions, we need to diagnose the problems. We diagnose the problems with some of these things with data. So, we've heard about this slogan, or maybe you guys aren't data nerds like I am, but data is the new gold. There's nothing more important than data, right? And so I feel very fortunate to be in a state like Kentucky that is really thoughtful and continues to be very thoughtful about using data and making data available so that we can all progress. And finally, I want to say, kind of end on a little bit of an optimistic note. Challenges and questions abound, but so do opportunities. I'm incredibly optimistic about the future, right? If you look at the arc of history, we have never been in a better place for the human condition globally. I know that there are reasons to feel pessimistic. I know that there are a lot of issues that we still need to solve. But the arc of history has shown that we are on the upswing. So I'm excited because of people like Michaela and people like you who have really worked to help students, to help workers, and to help progress this industry in this country. So thank you again for inviting me to be here. I really look forward to learning with you throughout the day today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.